Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon for our next installment of our JStream series. We're going to give everybody just a couple seconds to jump on the line. While we do that, I'll remind you, JStream is J Street's series of virtual offerings during the COVID-19 period of isolation, our effort to come together around the issues and principles that drive our work in this time of isolation. And so I thank you all for being with us this afternoon. I'm particularly excited for and energized by the conversation that we're about to have with Ari Berman and Leigh Chapman. Leigh is the director of the Voting Rights Program at the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which is the nation's oldest civil rights coalition. She's one of the foremost leaders in the movement to protect the ballot in this country. And Ari Berman is a senior reporter at Mother Jones covering voting rights. He's the author of Give Us the Ballot, the modern struggle for voting rights in America, and one of the nation's foremost chronicles of the rights effort to restrict the ballot in modern day America. So this is a particularly timely conversation. I know many J Street leaders have had front of mind the November election and protecting all Americans' right to vote in the coming election, particularly against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic and of this awakening that the country is having on the issue of race right now. Leigh, I want to turn to you first for just some opening thoughts, and then we'll go to you, Ari, on the unique challenges of this moment vis-a-vis voting rights. Like I said, informed by the pandemic, the degree to which the country's wrestling with our racist legacy of, among other things, restricting access to the ballot, and what's keeping you up at night when you think ahead to the November elections and what we all need to do to protect fellow Americans' right to vote.
Great, thank you so much, Ben, and thank you to J Street for having me today to discuss voting rights and how to protect our democracy, in particular during COVID-19. I just wanted to say, the Leadership Conference has been around for over 50 years, and we've lobbied and won the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, in 1960 and 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we also helped organize the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August 1963. So in addition to voting rights, we also work on the courts, immigrant rights, justice reform, policing, economic security, education, fighting hate and bias, and media and technology. But right now, we are in a moment that really calls for the voices of marginalized people to be louder than ever. And, voting is not going to magically solve all of our country's issues right now, but it really is the necessary action that we all must take to wield our power. And the confluence of the COVID-19 pandemic with protests over police brutality and state violence against Black Americans really presents unique challenges to holding an election this year. But while these are unprecedented times, we've seen in recent elections in Wisconsin, in Georgia, in Kentucky, that states are falling far short of their obligation to ensure that every voter can cast a ballot that counts. So when you ask me what keeps me up at night, voter disenfranchisement keeps me up at night. Voter suppression is what keeps me up at night. Seeing those lines of 7 hours in Georgia where all those lines are Black and brown and Latino voters, that keeps me up at night. We need to make sure that everyone can have access to the ballot box this year. And especially since COVID-19 is hitting Black and brown communities the hardest, we need to make sure that everyone's right to vote is protected. So the Leadership Conference right now is mainly focusing our lobbying efforts on voting in the federal level to pass the HEROES Act. And the HEROES Act would appropriate an additional $3.6 billion of funding to states so they can expand vote by mail. They can have safe early in-person voting, at least 2 weeks of early voting where people can social distance and be safe on election day. And that when people vote by mail, they don't have to pay for return postage. So that's one thing that we are advocating right now on the federal level. We've sent coalition letters to Congress, and that's something that's critical right now, so states and election officials can be prepared.
Excellent. Thanks, Leigh. And we'll dig in more on that legislation and other policy interventions to counteract voter suppression in just a moment. Ari, turning it to you, you've chronicled expertly modern day voter suppression and how it's linked to the legacy of Jim Crow, and how there's tools that are employed today, just like the white primaries and the poll tax of yore, that are used to restrict Americans' right to vote. Talk to us a bit off the bat about how that relates to the current pandemic and how such tools may be are being employed to an even greater extent in light of that pandemic.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben, and thank you to J Street for having me. And it's great to see Leigh again. We've known each other a long time, and if we don't get to see each other face to face, at least virtual is nice. So there's a few things that really worry me. The first thing that worries me is that the existing voter suppression could be a lot worse in November. For example, let's take voter ID laws. If you don't have the ID required to vote, it's going to be a lot more difficult to get it now, because in most states, people don't want to go to the DMV or other public agencies where you could get the required ID. Take voter purging. If you're removed from the voting rolls right now, it could be a lot harder to get re-registered. Voter registration drives are way down. So unless you can easily register again online, it might be very difficult to re-register. Take cutting polling places. The leadership conference where Leigh works did a great report about how there's been over 1,600 polling places closed since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. Well, all throughout the country, we saw polling places being closed in much greater numbers than you've ever seen before during the primary. So the efforts to make voting harder could be a lot more effective this year, because people don't have the tools to fight back in the same sort of way because of all the issues around the pandemic. And then you just take the question of, can the American electoral system handle what's coming? We're going to see voting by mail in record numbers. We're going to see 50, 60, 70% of the public potentially vote by mail across the country. We've never had an election like that in our country's history. In 2018, there were only 9 states where a majority of voters voted by mail, almost all of them exclusively in the western part of the country. We've never had a majority of people vote by mail in a general election in Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania or Florida. So can the election system handle that? Do people know how to get a mail ballot? Will they get their mail ballots in time? Will their mail ballots be counted? Every year we throw out tens of thousands of mail ballots because people don't sign their mail ballots, or election officials throw them out because the signatures aren't matched. We're going to expect those kind of issues to dramatically increase. And then can we handle in-person voting? Because in-person voting is going to be different too. What we've seen across the country in Georgia, in Wisconsin, in Nevada, in DC, in Maryland, in places that aren't necessarily voter suppression hotspots, incredibly long lines, because there were not nearly enough polling places open, because states couldn't recruit enough poll workers or find enough polling sites. So that really worries me. Is in-person voting, for those that want to use it, is that going to be safe and accessible, or are we going to see these really long lines? And then, lastly, you just add on top of that this really unbelievable disinformation and suppression effort that's being launched by the president and the Republican Party, where they've always wanted to make it more difficult, but this is like out of control what they're doing right now. I mean, if you look at what President Trump is saying about vote by mail, it's a complete lie. If you look at the fact that in pretty much every state where there's litigation to make voting easier, the Republican Party is on the other side, trying to make it more difficult. So I think even with the best of intentions, it's going to be really hard to pull off a smooth election given the public health crisis. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't have the best of intentions. And so that, to me, is a really combustible mix. The difficulties of the pandemic mixed with the fact that we are already facing this active voter suppression campaign.
Thanks for those opening thoughts, Ari. I'll remind everybody joining us that if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box below, and we'll field them as they come in. Leigh, another question, just back to policy interventions to counteract some of the challenges Ari just raised. We hear a lot about vote by mail. We also hear from our friends in the voting rights community that vote by mail is not in and of itself a panacea for these challenges. What other policy interventions should we be advocating, should we be looking towards to ensure that every American has the right to vote in November?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we are hearing a lot about vote by mail, but as you mentioned, vote by mail is not going to be the universal fix during this election. And while vote by mail is a great option, in-person voting that is safe needs to definitely be key to an election response plan. If we focus exclusively on vote by mail, it could disenfranchise voters of color, Native American voters, people with disabilities, non-English speakers, students, low-income families, and people also experiencing homelessness. So we have seen in recent primary elections, some people just prefer to cast their ballot in person. I know I have family members who say that they would prefer to go to the polling place on election day, or if they do vote by mail, they want to turn it they want to drop it off in a drop box or take it to the polls and turn it in. So because of that, election officials really need to make sure that they have an adequate number of polling places and that they're fully staffed to accommodate the demand on election day. And one thing that we're seeing is that poll workers are more often elderly. So it's critical that election officials are also looking at creative solutions to recruit younger poll workers who are less susceptible to COVID-19. But in addition to having vote by mail, we also need to have at least 2 weeks of early voting, including that last weekend before election day, which is essential for many communities who like to vote early in person that last weekend. We need to also have online voter registration. Not every state allows people to register to vote online. We're also advocating for same-day voter registration. And as Ari mentioned, voters have been purged from the voter rolls. We've seen over 1 million voters in Georgia purged when Brian Kemp, the now governor of Georgia, was Secretary of State. We've seen purges in Ohio, and the best solution to purges is to have the same day voter registration, because a lot of times people go to the polling place on election day and they don't know that they've been purged, so they could register to vote right there. And having guardrails in place are critical, so including what I mentioned before, having that prepaid postage is essential, because that could really amount to a poll tax if people have to go get a stamp, pay for the ability to have their absentee ballot mailed back.
And Ari, a lot of these changes in terms of how we administer elections state by state in states with a legacy of voter suppression had to be pre-cleared in the days of yore through Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and that's no longer the case since the Shelby decision. That seems kind of like the perfect stew for voter suppression this November. What unique challenges are there? And this ultimately is probably for both of you. What unique challenges do you see stemming from the gutting of the Voting Rights Act in Section 5 looking ahead to November?
Well, there's been a huge impact since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in a whole host of ways, from states like Texas and North Carolina rushing to pass new voter ID laws that disproportionately burden communities of color, or whether it's the fact that over 1,600 polling places were closed in states with a long history of discrimination, whether it's the fact that in states with a long history of discrimination, they are 40% more likely to purge voters from the rolls than in other states. So we've seen some real challenges in states that weren't covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, places like Wisconsin and Ohio. But we've also have seen magnified challenges by places that were covered. And you look at what happened in 2018 in Georgia, the fact that over 200 polling places were closed, the fact that 50,000 people were put on a suspended registration list before the election, 80% of them people of color. Those are the kind of things that would have had to have been approved by the federal government under the Voting Rights Act. And in fact, some of those things had been blocked under the Voting Rights Act and then were allowed to be put into effect. And so if states want to implement potentially discriminatory voting changes, they would have had to get those approved, and now they don't have to. So I'm worried about that. I'm worried about what Georgia might do for November. I'm worried about what Texas might do for November. Some of these states already have these extremely restrictive laws. I'll just give you one example. This is probably, I think, the worst example in the country right now. In Texas, if you're over 65, you can vote by mail for any reason. If you're under 65, it's virtually impossible to vote by mail. You have to be either out of the county, incarcerated, or have what is they're terming a physical illness or disability. And the courts and the Republican Attorney General in Texas have said that fear of contracting COVID is not a sufficient reason to get an absentee ballot in Texas, because they said it's an emotional condition, now a physical one. So in Texas, what that means is that people over 65 who are disproportionately white and disproportionately Republican are going to have an easier time getting an absentee ballot than people under 65, who in Texas in particular are disproportionately young and disproportionately communities of color. They are going to have almost an impossible time voting by mail. And so then you're saying, okay, what do they have to do? They have to go vote in person. Well, Texas has closed hundreds of polling places in person. They haven't made it easy to vote in person either. So that's a recipe for disaster. We saw even before the pandemic, 6-hour lines in Texas during their primary in either late February or early March. And so that's the situation I'm really worried about, whereas states are making it hard to vote by mail, particularly for certain communities, but they're also making it hard to vote in person for those very same communities. So what are we going to do when we know that there's probably going to be unprecedented turnout in November, given the fact that Donald Trump is up for re-election, and also given all the talk about voting as one possible solution to this history of systemic racism in our country?
Yeah. And
What about your thoughts?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, you referenced the Shelby County versus Holder decision, which is the decision that really opened the floodgates to recent modern day voter suppression. And last week marked the 7th anniversary of that Supreme Court decision. And the Leadership Conference led a national week of action with our coalition to not only call on Congress to pass the HEROES Act so we can have that immediate and necessary funding for this election, but also to restore the Voting Rights Act. Our coalition has worked for the last 7 years since the Shelby County decision to document continued and persistent racial discrimination in voting. So we all work together to write reports. What Ari mentioned, we wrote the report about polling place closures. There have been reports about voter ID laws, just all the methods around the country to make it harder for people of color to vote in the last 7 years. And there's a legislative solution to this. Representative Terry Sewell from the 7th District of Alabama has sponsored a bill called the Voting Rights Advancement Act, or HR 4, and it actually passed the House of Representatives in December after we had about a dozen hearings all around the country and also in DC, showing that persistent and continued evidence of voter discrimination. While that bill passed the House in December, we had one Republican vote for the bill. It really has just stalled in the Senate. Senator McConnell has put it in his legislative graveyard. He has not acted on it, which is really a shame, because if we had HR 4, if we have a Voting Rights Advancement Act in place, we can prevent the voter registration purges that Ari mentioned. We can prevent the implementation of photo ID laws that disproportionately prevent voters of color from casting ballots. We can prevent jurisdictions from closing polling places. We can prevent gerrymandering that dilutes Black and brown votes, and we can prevent any additional requirements and documentation like citizenship paperwork. So, we have some policy, well thought out policy solutions, but, because voting rights has become so political and partisan, which is very unfortunate, it really should be a nonpartisan effort that everyone should be advocating for. That bill has stalled in the Senate, and McConnell has yet to take action.
And I'll take advantage of that to seize on one of the questions that's come in the queue. I'll remind everybody too that you can ask questions in the Q&A box. You can type them at the bottom of your screen. Leigh, just wanted to ask, we got a question about the partisanship on this issue. Apropos of your answer, want to ask, are there any Republicans, whether, maybe they're governors at the state level, maybe they are senators whose voices have just been a little bit more mellow to this point, who at least in light of this current crisis are starting to embrace some of these reforms? Is there any cause for bipartisan hope on that front?
The Leadership Conference has been working in coalition with some bipartisan voices and organizations that represent more bipartisan voices, because COVID-19 is affecting Republicans and Democrats, right? So everybody really should be concerned about this. We've been also working with Secretary of State Kim Wyman in Washington State, who's a Republican who has implemented vote by mail for many years. So she's often speaks about the importance of vote by mail, how it's safe and secure, how it doesn't necessarily benefit one party or another. So we have some secretaries of state who've been champions for this additional funding and who have been champions for vote by mail. You know, on the federal side, former Secretary of State Blunt, who's now Senator Blunt from Missouri, he has said that he does believe that states do need additional funding for elections. He's made public statements on that front. But, you know, it's been challenging. You know, we're doing the best we can at working in coalition with some unlikely allies, some voices that might have the ear of some Republicans, but it's important for us all to come together in this moment to emphasize the need to have safe and accessible elections this year.
And Ari, another question that we just got in, and this may also ultimately be for both of you, is you know, one tactic that we've seen in certain locales is to challenge folks' right to vote at the polls, and so that takes on a totally different nature, of course, when folks are voting by mail. Are there any sorts of policies that we should be on the lookout for as it pertains to how ballots are actually counted when they're sent by mail? For instance, how many states require that representatives of 2 or more parties will have to agree on which mail-in ballots will be counted and which not? Are there, not that you would know that number offhand, but are there certain methods for how mail-in ballots are counted that we should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so I mean, I would raise 2 points about that. First off, mail ballots can be pretty restrictive in certain states. So like there are certain states where just filling out your ballot can be a challenge. Like there are a dozen states, including Wisconsin, where you have to have a witness watch you sign or fill out your ballot or attest to it. So that's very difficult at a time of social distancing. And there's litigation around that. In some states, like in Florida, you have to have your ballot returned by election day, which can be very difficult because how do you know when your ballot's going to be sent back? That really is up to the post office and election officials, not the voters. So there are fights about that. Should ballots have to be received or postmarked by election day? There are lots of fights over signature matching. Can ballots be thrown out because the signatures didn't match? In Florida, they threw out over 30,000 ballots for that reason, and there was a huge disparate impact. Young voters were 8 times more likely than old voters to have their ballots thrown out. Black and brown voters were twice as likely as white voters to have their ballots thrown out. So there's disproportionate impact in terms of ballots being tossed. There are like about 2 dozen states that don't even require election officials to tell you if there's a problem with your mail ballot, so you might not even know. Whereas if you vote in person, it's much more likely if there's an issue with your ballot, you're going to know about it and have an opportunity to do something about it. So those are all the things I'm worried about with mail ballots. And then in terms of voter challenges, one of the really significant things that happens this year is that there was basically a consent decree for over 20 years prohibiting the Republican Party from doing what was called ballot security operations, basically trying to challenge the eligibility of people at the polls, because there was a long history of the Republicans doing really racist stuff, like trying to prevent Black people from voting and kicking them off the rolls in places like Louisiana and New Jersey. And now the Republican Party is going to be able to do that again. So they have said, we'll see if this actually happens, they have said they are going to recruit 50,000 people to try to monitor the polls and challenge people's eligibility. So you can imagine the chaos of there are not enough polling places, COVID is still spreading, and then suddenly there's all of these people challenging your eligibility to vote if you decide to actually go vote in person. That is really concerning, along with all of these restrictive measures to try to make it so that your absentee ballot isn't counted.
And Leigh, so Georgia, Kentucky, Wisconsin, 3 states that have had primaries during the pandemic and where we've seen just nightmare scenarios unfold, including just last week in Kentucky, where we saw Black voters literally just banging on the windows to get into a polling place that they were in line to vote at. What can we learn from these 3 states and the experiences they had in the primaries when we're looking ahead to a November election when turnout is going to go up by a significant amount and the challenges are going to be that much more?
Yeah, so you're right. Those there was just chaos at polling places in all of those states that you mentioned. You know, in Milwaukee, there were only 5 polling places, and there are typically 180. So, voters were standing in line for hours, and it's reported that over 70 people actually contracted COVID-19 on election day in Wisconsin, either from being a voter or from being a poll worker. So that, is challenging, and, no one should have to choose between their safety and their right to vote. In Georgia, we saw machines break down, and these were actually new voting machines that the state rolled out during the primary. Poll workers received inadequate training on those machines, which is why we saw so many problems. And we saw voters stand in line for up to 7 hours in the heat and humidity and in the rain after failing to receive mail-in ballots. We saw Stacey Abrams said that her absentee ballot, the return envelope was sealed shut. So she was trying to steam it open to get it open. The mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, didn't even receive her absentee ballot in time. And of course, in Georgia, we saw some of the worst lines in Fulton County, which is home to Atlanta with the highest Black population in the state. And as you mentioned last week in Kentucky and Louisville, a community that's still, calling for justice in the killing of Breonna Taylor, there was only one polling place and people were banging on those doors when the polls closed. They eventually did get in, but we shouldn't have a scenario where there's one polling place for a county that has over 600,000 voters on election day. So we need to make sure that all these issues don't happen again in November. And that's why the HEROES Act is so critical, because we don't want there to be an excuse, and we don't want states to say, oh, we don't have the funds, or we don't have the money to hire more poll workers and open more polling places and print more absentee ballots. So that's why the funding is such a critical piece in this. But groups like the Leadership Conference and our coalition are also working in states with election administrators to fix these problems well in advance of election day, and to also hold them accountable to make sure that they're putting policy reforms in place, like what Ari and I have talked about, making sure that they're expanding absentee and mail voting, making sure that voters actually receive them. And one critical piece is voter education, because voters are going to be voting by mail in the highest rates we've ever seen, and a lot of voters have never cast their vote by mail before. So we're also pushing on election officials to do that critical voter education so people know how to cast their ballot in a safe manner and how to return it so it's counted properly.
Thank you, Leigh. Ari, something that I know is on many of our supporters' minds is how to distinguish between genuine efforts to adapt to an unprecedented context when it comes to how states and locales are administering their elections versus efforts to suppress the vote that are just masking as genuine efforts to adapt to a unique context. As a journalist who covers this stuff, what are the key distinguishing factors that you're on the lookout for in that regard?
Well, take Wisconsin, for example. The fact that Milwaukee went from 180 to 5 polling places, I don't think was necessarily intentional voter suppression, because they were really struggling to recruit poll workers. But you look at the context of that election. The legislature refused to mail ballots to all registered voters. So that made more people have to vote in person. The legislature refused to delay the primary. So that created the fact that there was a primary during an unprecedented public health crisis in April when cases were really spiking. So that made it more dangerous to vote in person. So, I mean, the decisions being made statewide and also federal are impacting local officials. And to the extent that local officials have the money they need, the equipment they need, the resources they need, the fact that it's being made easier to vote, you're going to see fewer problems, right? But then when you start cutting back on stuff, when you start making it hard to vote by mail, that leads to both more ballots being thrown out and also puts more stress on in-person voting. Because one commonality that we've seen in a lot of these states with long lines was the fact that some people showed up in person because they didn't get their mail ballots. They wanted to vote by mail and they were unable to. And so then you start looking at, well, what's the laws for in-person voting? Is it happening in states that have already closed a lot of polling places? Is it happening in communities of color in particular that have not gotten the resources they need from state officials? So, I mean, I think it's not like, you look at Georgia, it's not like suddenly there was voting problems one day on a primary because of a pandemic. There were issues in Georgia that were exacerbated by a pandemic. And that's why I think the context is really important. There were issues in states that don't have bad records on voting rights, because I think people were overwhelmed. But the fear is that a lot of the issues came in places that already had bad records on voting rights. And so the question is, what are those states doing for November? And are they going to be allowed to pursue policies that will help voters? And two trends that I saw this week that discouraged me was, in Georgia, the Secretary of State said he's not going to mail absentee ballot request forms to all registered voters for November, which is one thing they did well during the primary. And in Iowa, where they actually had a very smooth election, where the Republican Secretary of State mailed ballots to every registered voter, the legislature there passed a law prohibiting him from doing it again. So in terms of your question about partisanship, there are actually a lot of Republican officials on the state level that want to have smooth elections, that don't want to see 7-hour lines, that don't want to have their footage on Rachel Maddow. But the question is, are they being constrained by the legislative leaders, by President Trump, by the Republican Party? That dynamic is something that I'm keeping an eye on, because what's happening at the top starts filtering down in terms of how easy or hard it is to vote.
And Leigh, I know you don't do litigation, but in light of the gutting of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, Ari's talking about patterns that persist across states, regardless of their legacy on these issues, their historic legacy on these issues. Is there an opportunity to maybe use Section 2, which my understanding isn't hooked to the geographic legacy on voting suppression and voting rights, to challenge some of these policies that are being put in place in advance of the election, or no?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, when we talk about the Shelby County versus Holder case and the Voting Rights Act being gutted, that was limited to Section 5, which was the pre-clearance formula, which looked at those states and jurisdictions with a historic systemic pattern of voter discrimination. And it required them to have their election laws and policies pre-approved by the federal government and Department of Justice before they could go into effect. But Section 2 is a provision of the Voting Rights Act, which is still alive and well, along with all the other provisions, which allows individuals or groups to sue if there is racial discrimination in voting. And we've seen that as a tool used all across the country. I was part of the team that sued under Section 2 against the Wisconsin voter ID law. We lost ultimately, but the problem with a lot of these cases under Section 2, while it's an important tool that organizations like Lawyers Committee, LDF, Brennan Center, the other groups that are litigating use, is that litigation takes a long time. Litigation is very expensive. And a lot of times litigation is brought after the fact, right? So after voter disenfranchisement happens and occurs. So, that's why we need to have Section 5. That's also why we need to have a modern Voting Rights Act. And under the Sewell bill, it's really interesting because it looks at the recent issues of voter suppression in Wisconsin and states that weren't traditionally in the South. And it also would require pre-clearance of some of those procedures for states nationwide, not just the ones in the South. So while litigation is a critical and important tool, and we're seeing groups use it to stop some of these issues, especially right now, we're seeing a lot of lawsuits to expand vote by mail. It's just, it's one tool in the toolbox, and the easiest thing is for states to make it easier, not harder, for people to vote.
And then, Ari, we're getting a lot of questions about USPS. So as a reporter who's closely following these issues, with USPS teetering on the brink and such a critical piece of the puzzle looking ahead towards November, is this something that you're tracking, worried about, and what should we be looking out for?
Yeah, I am worried about the Postal Service, and I don't know if Leigh has anything to add on that, but there's sort of two critical issues that are facing the post office. One is the fact that they say they're going to run out of money. And relatively soon. And I think that's something that a lot of senators, including a lot of Republican senators, are worried about, because Republicans get a lot of mail too. And in fact, they tend to represent more rural areas that really need the post office very badly, especially now. The second issue is the effort by the Trump administration to try to politicize the post office. And this hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention, but the new Postmaster General was the chief fundraiser for the Republican convention. That seems very alarming. longtime deputy of the post office, was resigned or pushed out. He was the point person on vote by mail. And so a lot of people are wondering what the Trump administration is trying to do with the post office. In articles about it, a lot of it's been framed about the fact that the president doesn't like Amazon and doesn't like Jeff Bezos, and he's going after the post office for that reason. But I don't know what the reason is, but it seems like it's not just a coincidence that the fact that we're going to see vote by mail in record numbers in November. The post office is going to be more important than ever in collecting and receiving ballots. And we're seeing this unprecedented politicization when that's all going on. And I think this is something that all of us can talk about, because pretty much every American has experience with the post office, likes the post office, wants the post office to function. This should not be a partisan political issue. In the same way that vote by mail should not be a partisan political issue. Leigh will tell you, I will tell you, Republicans were the ones who were trying to push expanded vote by mail for the longest time. Talk to Republican activists in Arizona or Florida. They are pushing all of their people for years to try to vote by mail. They represent older, rural, wider communities that want to vote by mail. So this should not be politicized. The post office, voting by mail, these are things that a lot of people across the partisan spectrum do. And I think we just have to keep pushing back on the politicization of these. And when President Trump or others tries to politicize them, we should basically just say, these are things that people of all political persuasions want to be able to access. And there's nothing inherently political about voting by mail or the post office.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is we've been speaking about the HEROES Act in the context of elections and the additional $3.6 billion needed for states immediately. But there's also a provision in the HEROES Act which would allocate $25 billion to the Postal Service. So we can make sure that they are fully staffed and have the money they need to move forward.
Excellent. We have one more question for you here, Leigh, and then I'll turn to both of you for some closing thoughts before we sign off. But Leigh, just really quickly, what odds do you give the HEROES Act? And if not the HEROES Act, what do you think the most likely avenue is for implementing some of these reforms, at least through the federal level?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Senate has yet to take action on the HEROES Act. It passed in May. So we are using every advocacy effort we can in order to move it in the Senate. You know, we are working in coalition with bipartisan groups. We are also working with some celebrity influencers. I don't know if you saw recently, but we worked on a letter with the mothers of the movement, you know, those mothers who have lost their sons and daughters to police violence. And also Beyonce's mother, celebrities, to call on the Senate to pass the HEROES Act and to really make that connection between policing and voting, and the fact that in order for us to have the change we want to see in our country, everyone has to have access to the ballot box. So we are, you know, doing a full court press on trying to get the HEROES Act passed. Because of all the partisanship right now, we're not sure what's going to happen. There are some Republicans in the Senate who have indicated that they think that we are going to get some additional funding when it comes to elections, but we're just not sure what that's going to look like yet. So at the same time we're pushing on the federal advocacy piece, we are also working in the states to make sure that states are, you know, expanding vote by mail, loosening some of these restrictions like Ari mentioned about witness signatures. You know, some states also require you to have a notary sign your ballot, which is something that's ridiculous and also costs money. And we're working in the state level also to expand early voting, basically everything that we've talked about on this call so far. So it really is a two-pronged approach. And also, you know, we're thinking about how we can use potentially corporate resources. You know, some corporations have said, we want to help out, you know, if states don't get money. So how can we help recruit poll workers? So we are really looking at every avenue to expand the right to vote and protect it this year.
Excellent. So in closing, Ari, interested in hearing from you about what the story is that you're following on this stuff that you think should be front of mind for J Street leaders across the country that maybe we've lost sight of. And from you, Leigh, I'm getting a lot of questions about folks. How can they help in the vital efforts that LCCR is leading to protect the integrity of the November elections, but even beyond this year, to make sure that we enfranchise all of our neighbors. So to you first, Ari, and then Leigh for some closing thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the primaries are really the only test run that we're going to have for November. and we learned a few really important things. One is that people are going to want to vote by mail in unprecedented numbers. And those numbers are only going to increase in November, when a lot of new voters and a lot of infrequent voters that don't vote in primaries want to vote. And so if I'm a local leader or local activist, I'm asking my county and I'm asking my state reps and I'm asking my Secretary of State, what are you doing to prepare for unprecedented turnout among mail ballots? And then I'm also saying one of the recurring themes throughout all the primaries was long lines at the polls. So I'm asking local officials again, what are you doing to prepare for in-person voting? This was sort of the overlooked thing. States kind of went from one extreme to the other. We went from a country where pretty much most people voted in person to a primaries in which many people voted by mail. And that was a really rocky transition. And so I'm asking what is being done to make it easy to vote in person, but also what is being done to make it easy to vote by mail. And also, some states actually broaden their laws for the primaries. States, for example, where you need an excuse to get an absentee ballot, they waived that for the primaries. Are they going to do the same thing for November? In Kentucky, for example, where they made it very easy to vote by mail, where it was previously very difficult to vote by mail. Is that same kind of thing going to happen when Mitch McConnell's on the ballot up for re-election? That's the kind of thing that I'm paying attention to. And then in terms of what people can do, and I know Leigh will add to this, but I think it's really important, check your registration now, because it's not necessarily going to be that easy to re-register in November or in October. If you're going to vote by mail, request your ballot early to put less stress on the system, but also to give yourself more time to get it and to fill it out. If you're going to vote in person, try to vote early. Usually the lines are shorter during early voting, and there's more potential to fix your ballot. Then I would say if people are healthy and willing, you might need to volunteer to be an election worker. You might need to volunteer to be a poll worker. It's going to be a different kind of year this year. We can't just kind of rely on the experts to go handle the election. We're all going to have to chip in some form or another. And so I think there's a lot of different ways for people to get active, but I think they have to start doing it now. Because I know from my past experience, people always start emailing you like a week before the election and say, what's happening with voting rights? Well, that's difficult in any scenario, but especially in this kind of public health crisis, you've got to start making the changes now if you want to have a smooth election in November.
Thanks, Ari. Over to you, Leigh, for some closing thoughts.
Yeah, I would echo everything Ari said. And I would say if you want to take action on trying to put pressure on the Senate to pass the HEROES Act, we have a petition, and it's located at andstillivote.org/heroes. And the And Still I Vote campaign is a campaign that the Leadership Conference launched at the end of February during the 55th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, as we were crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And we launched this campaign because we knew, this is before COVID, but we knew that 2020 was going to be a very challenging year when it came to voter suppression. So we wanted to shine a spotlight on the barriers to the ballot that voters of color have faced, for so many decades and continue to face, and also mobilize people to take action. So that's why we started this campaign. So you can go to that link, fill out the petition. But broadly, if you want to get involved, we have developed some advocacy training modules, and we're happy to disseminate this to J Street, just to train individuals who want to protect the vote in their communities on how to best do it. So like what Ari was saying, going to election official meetings, asking your election officials, how many polling places are going to be in my county? How are you handling vote by mail? What are you doing to accommodate to make sure that people are safe during this pandemic while they're voting? We're giving individuals and groups the tools they need to advocate for that in their communities. So I'm happy to facilitate a training maybe for J Street if people are interested. But I would echo everything that Ari said on the individual level as far as checking your voter registration. I think also asking your friends and family if they're registered, and helping to make sure that they're registered as well.
Excellent. Thank you both. We've got the andstillivote.org link in the chat for those of you joining us, so you can access it there. We'll also send it out after the fact to the J Street Leadership listserv. We'll also send out some more information on how you can support the Leadership Conference's critical work. And I love that idea, Leigh, about doing a training for J Street folks on some of those really practical skills. So I will definitely take you up on that and be in touch with you about that.
Wonderful. Happy to.
And excellent. And I just want to thank you both again for making the time this afternoon. Such an important, such a timely issue. And I know that J Street leaders across the country are big fans of your work, Leigh, and Ari rely on your reporting. So we're really grateful to both of you for making the time this afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Take
Thanks,
care.
everybody.